As seen in my previous video, ARC Raiders will run fine on Polaris-based video cards, though the 2GB RX 460 pointed out that, at least for AMD cards, 2GB is not going to cut it. The game states the RX 580 and the GTX 1050 Ti for their minimum specs GPU. Besides the difference in raw computing power, the Nvidia card comes with half of the VRAM of the Radeon. Does this mean that the Nvidia card can do more with less? To answer that question, I selected the following cards. The as requested minimum spec GPU, the GTX 1050 Ti. This little 4GB card really grew on me. The less usual variant of the GTX 960. This one also uses 4GB of VRAM, making it functionally equivalent to the 1050 Ti. And the typical GTX 960, using just 2GB of VRAM. Despite seeing how the RX 460 ran last time, I decided to give this one a try. Hope dies last, it seems. For the test system, I used the custom build PC I made in the previous year, with some changes done since then. The CPU is now a Ryzen 5 5600, and the 32GB of DDR4 was replaced with a dual channel kit that runs at 36 MHz right now. I mentioned this also in the previous video. I used low settings for all three tested resolutions without any upscaling. This is mostly because Full HD resolution with quality FSR gets about the same pixel count as 1280 by 720, and it doesn't make sense to test the same pixel count again. We are starting off with 720 resolution, for unfortunately similar reasons as with the previous video. The VRAM required at this resolution when running Nvidia cards is still closer to 3GB. And just like the RX 460, the 2GB variant of the GTX 960 ends up delivering the similarly potato-looking graphics. This means that while the game will not stutter, with 74 FPS on average and 53 FPS for the 1% lows, it's not going to be the best experience either, with some of the translucent textures sometimes not being rendered at all. Having enough VRAM to actually render those surfaces, however, means that the GM206 GPU powering the 960 has some actually work to do. The 4GB variant therefore averages slightly less, at 67 FPS, with a playable 49 FPS for the 1% lows. And the leader of the pack is the tiny GTX 1050 Ti, averaging in the mid-80s with 1% lows of 52 FPS. Going forward to 1600 by 900, we're going to ditch the 2GB variant of the GTX 960. I was hoping that 720 resolution would work for them, but it turns out that, while hope dies last, it does die eventually. This then leaves the 4GB cards with much closer results this time around. The 4GB GTX 960 manages 59 FPS on average and 44 FPS for the 1% lows, and the 1050 Ti gets 63 FPS for the average and 48 FPS for the same percentile performance metric. Now, I know that I stated that 30 plus FPS for the 1% lows is playable, but having that metric paired with 40 plus FPS on average makes for a better game experience with lower input latency. And while the two GTX cards seem to be able of delivering this at 1080 resolution, there's only one way to find out. So, 1080 resolution and low settings, and, as seen on screen right now, both 4GB cards manage a playable experience and a bit more. The only GTX 960 that will still render the game just fine manages mid-50s for the average FPS and 41 FPS for the 1% lows. The 1050 Ti manages similar performance, and the difference between the two can very well be due to inherent differences when spawning in different spots on a fairly large map. At this point we can draw some conclusions with regard to the GPU required for 1080 resolution. It has to be a DirectX 12 compatible GPU. It should have more than 2GB of VRAM available, and we know that 4GB cards run fine at 1080 resolution and lower. It should have an FP32 computing power of at least 2 teraflops. But this also raises more questions. How hard is that DirectX 12 requirement? Would older GCN 1 or 2 cards have a similar performance? What about GPUs that have just under 2 teraflops FP42? Can they still play at least at low resolutions? And we didn't even touch on the CPU side of this game, where developers list a non-hyper-threaded quad-core as equivalent to a 6-core part that has SMT. Stay tuned if you find these questions to be interesting as well. As for this one, we're done. Thanks for watching it, I hope I didn't just rob you of your time, and I'll see you for the next one.